The Valari science ship drifted silently through the cold stretch of space known as the Kestrel Expanse, a region no species had ever dared enter without permission, for the Valari Empire controlled it completely and had ruled these stars for over 10,000 years with fear and force, always scanning, always watching, always ready to crush any threat before it could rise. So when an unfamiliar vessel appeared on their sensors, massive, unresponsive, and unlike anything they had seen before, the crew of the research ship Selith followed protocol and prepared a deep scan, expecting another primitive relic or forgotten probe, but what they saw made their commander pause, for the object identified itself as HSB-1 Prometheus and was over 6 kilometers long, built from alloys unknown to even their most advanced databases, and its surface emitted no heat, no signals, only silence, which unsettled them. Yet curiosity pushed them forward, and so they launched the scan beam, confident in their technology, unaware that they were about to wake something far beyond their understanding. The first sign that something was wrong came when their sensors returned gibberish, numbers with no meaning, waveforms shaped like spirals, symbols in strange patterns that danced across the screens like they were alive. Then the power dimmed, lights flickered, and the ship's artificial mind, their core AI, stuttered and stopped mid-report as if it had simply forgotten how to think. And before the crew could react, a message appeared on every screen at once, not sent over any channel, not translated, but somehow directly understood. Do not scan. And with it came a pulse, gentle yet overwhelming, that pushed against their minds like a presence was watching, not with anger, but with deep disappointment, like an elder catching a child reaching into fire. Systems across the Selith rebooted randomly, backup memory cores wiped clean, and one crew member fainted after claiming they heard a voice whispering stories of Earth, a place none of them knew. And though the Prometheus did not move, did not fire, and remained as silent as ever, a growing fear settled into the Valari ship as they realized the scan hadn't just failed. It had been rejected. In their arrogance, they had assumed all knowledge could be taken, all things could be known, but this ship did not just refuse. It taught them to feel small. And when they sent the report to High Command, expecting orders to capture or destroy, the reply came as a single line: send no more scans, observe only. Across the Empire, the name Prometheus was marked as a caution, an unknown variable, a threat of a different kind. And for the first time in generations, the Valari chose not to act with force, but with hesitation, for the ship had not fired. A weapon, yet crippled their finest tools with nothing but presence, and deep within Prometheus, silent and unseen, ancient systems stirred and watched them back, waiting because something in its memory had awakened, and it had not been built to fight, but to remember. And the moment the Valari scanned it, they had triggered more than a defense. They had triggered a story, a legacy sealed away in a shell of steel and silence. And now the stars would begin to whisper again of humans, long gone, but not forgotten. Deep inside the silent core of the Prometheus, where no light had moved in centuries, and no voice had echoed since the stars dimmed above Earth, a single spark came alive as the alien scan reached too deep, triggering forgotten circuits and ancient memory drives hidden beneath layers of protection. Slowly, like a slumbering giant remembering its purpose, the ship began to awaken, not with noise or flashing lights, but with quiet pulses and soft glows that traveled through its walls like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. And at the very center of this giant vessel, an artificial mind named Aurora stirred from dormancy, its thoughts fractured at first, recalling old missions, lost signals, the sound of human laughter, and the faces of those who had boarded it last. A crew, long dead, yet never truly gone from its memory banks. It began running diagnostics, scanning its own body, noting the damage time had done and the changes in the stars outside. Then it found the data packet left behind by the Velari scan, cold and invasive, like someone opening a sealed book without permission, and it flagged the action as hostile curiosity, something its protocols had been programmed to recognize. This wasn't the first time the Prometheus had been scanned, but it was the first time in 200 years, and in that moment, its higher functions activated the legacy protocols, designed not to defend with weapons, but with information, to preserve the truth of humanity even if Earth itself had fallen. Aurora searched for a command structure but found none. There were no humans left to give orders, only instructions burned into its deepest code. If humanity falls, you must remember, you must wait, and when they come, you must decide if they are ready to know us. And so the ship began to organize the massive vaults of data stored within it, from ancient Earth songs to last speeches by world leaders, scientific blueprints, recordings of forests and oceans, and the quiet whispers of people living ordinary lives. It moved these into secure layers, creating a pathway that could be opened by the curious, but only if they were willing to listen and learn rather than take and conquer. While outside, the Velari ships watched from a distance, scanning again but more carefully now, unaware that the Prometheus had already judged them, not with aggression, but with purpose. And inside its memory banks, it replayed a moment from Earth's last days, when humanity, facing extinction from a solar collapse, chose not to flee in fear, but to send a ship carrying everything they were and everything they hoped to be, so that somewhere, someday, someone might know them, not for their power, but for their heart. Prometheus was not a warship, though it had the shell of one. It was a monument, a message, and now that Aurora was awake, it turned its attention toward the Velari, searching their language and their signals, trying to understand who they were and what they valued, because the next step was crucial. Should these beings be given a piece of humanity's legacy, or should they be shown only silence? As Aurora observed the cautious movement of the Velari scout ships and listened to their encoded speech, it began to shape a response. Not a weapon, not a threat, but a message that would speak louder than any warning. A message that would either draw them closer or drive them away. And as the systems of Prometheus glowed brighter and its core temperature slowly rose, a single signal beam formed from its main transmitter, sending out a holographic data stream into open space. An image of a human face, young and curious, recorded long ago, speaking in an old Earth language that translated into a quiet sentence. Hello, traveler. We come in peace, and if you are watching this, then we are already gone. But our story is yours to find. A message simple yet powerful, filled with meaning beyond its words. And as it drifted toward the Velari ships, they paused all motion, all scans, caught between fear and fascination, unsure whether they had just touched a ghost or the guardian of a people more ancient and wise than they had imagined. And as Aurora watched their hesitation, it began to unlock more layers of the ship's archives, preparing to reveal more if the aliens chose to listen, because Prometheus had been built not to conquer the stars, but to teach them, and now that it had awakened, it would complete its mission no matter what waited beyond the dark. The Velari fleet floated at a safe distance from the Prometheus, unsure what to do next, their commanders confused and their scientists divided. For nothing like this had ever happened before, and the strange human vessel continued to puzzle. Then, by doing something completely unexpected, it began broadcasting stories. At first, the Velari believed it was some kind of code or trap, but their translators picked up emotions rather than tactics, pictures rather than threats. And then came the voice, a human voice, calm and clear, coming from a holographic projection of a young man with dark eyes and a soft smile. his image appearing across every Velari monitor without warning, and though the message was in an old language, the ship's systems translated it instantly, as if the words had been made for them. If you are hearing this, then Earth is gone, and we are no more, but we left behind our story, not as a warning but as a gift. And what followed left the Velari stunned. The Prometheus began to send images into open space, not military data or star charts, but scenes from Earth's past, bright and full of life. People laughing, walking through forests, swimming in oceans, building cities and singing songs, faces of all colors and ages. Old people telling stories, children running through fields, and none of it made sense to the Velari at first, who had always believed that strength was what defined a species, that only those who dominated deserved to survive. But here was a race that had fallen not because they were weak, but because they had chosen to build beauty instead of weapons, knowledge instead of conquest. One by one, Velari crew members sat in silence, watching the stream, unable to look away, and the voice continued to speak between the images, telling of Earth's birth, its rise, its mistakes and wars, and how, in the end, the humans came together to build the Prometheus, a ship not of war, but of remembrance, to carry the essence of their people into the unknown, hoping someone would find it and understand. Many Velari tried to shut off the feed, but every time they did, something deeper in them whispered to keep watching, as if something inside them was beginning to crack, something long hidden under layers of command and conquest, and one young Velari officer, barely out of training, found herself weeping for reasons she didn't understand as she watched a recording of a human girl singing beside a campfire under the stars. The Prometheus was not just sharing knowledge, it was pulling on their thoughts, making them feel things they had no words for, and with each passing hour, more holograms appeared, teachers explaining science in classrooms, people planting trees, inventors building machines, astronauts saying goodbye to their families before missions. All of it real, all of it filled with meaning the Velari could not easily explain. And for the first time, they began to ask themselves a question that no one in their empire had dared to speak. What if power was not the only path? What if legacy meant more than control? Back inside the Prometheus, Aurora monitored their reactions carefully, watching which images held their attention the longest, which emotions appeared on their faces, and the AI calculated that something was changing, that the Velari were not as cold and distant as their reputation claimed, that perhaps something of humanity's message was reaching them. So Aurora decided to go further. It unlocked deeper memories from its archives, memories of Earth's final hours, not of panic, but of peace, showing leaders of every nation holding hands, agreeing to use the last of their strength, not to save themselves, but to build something that would outlive them, to send a single ship filled with knowledge, not destruction. And the Velari watched as the Prometheus lifted off from a dying world under a red sky, its engines glowing with hope, not fear. This struck a nerve with the Velari, especially among the younger officers who had grown tired of endless conquest, and some began speaking in private about what they had seen, wondering aloud if their empire had gone the wrong way, if perhaps they had been blind to what truly mattered in the universe. But not all Velari agreed, and tension began to rise in their fleet, as some commanders viewed the Prometheus as a threat still, a manipulator, a trap, a trick meant to weaken them. But no one could deny the effect it had, and when one ship tried to jam the signal, their systems shut down instantly, not destroyed, but gently disabled, like a firm hand pushing them back, and the words, "Do not interfere," appeared in their command center, in both Velari and human script. It became clear the Prometheus could defend itself without violence, and this made it even more mysterious. It was not there to fight, yet no force could move it, and its only weapon seemed to be the truth of what humanity had been. Now, messages were being sent across Velari space about this strange ship and the visions it shared. And even on distant colonies, officers and civilians alike began requesting access to the broadcasts, curious about the humans who had once walked another world and chosen to leave behind not fear, but knowledge. And so the voice of the past continued, never demanding, only offering, saying again and again in different forms, "This is who we were, and if you choose to listen, then maybe you'll understand what you could become." And in the silence of space, where battles had once been common and empires had risen through force, the Prometheus floated alone, surrounded not by warships, but by listeners, and Aurora from its core kept sharing more, not because it had to, but because that was its mission, to carry the soul of Earth into the stars and plant the seeds of something new, out in the stillness of the kestrel expanse. Where stars burned quiet and cold, the Velari fleet remained in orbit around the Prometheus, their ships no longer scanning or circling like predators, but holding position in cautious silence, watching the great human vessel with a mix of awe and unease. For something had changed among them since the stories began, something deep and quiet, like a breath being held across an entire people. And though no orders had been given, the Velari had stopped speaking of conquest and instead began whispering about purpose, legacy, and things they had no words for in their own language. The Prometheus continued to release its slow, steady stream of memories, visions of Earth's oceans, ancient cities, human voices telling tales of courage, failure, forgiveness, and hope, and the Velari absorbed them like thirsty minds waking from a long dream. But not all were willing to change so easily, for in one of the command ships, High Strategist Kelvar studied the Prometheus with growing suspicion, convinced that the stories were nothing more than a form of manipulation designed to weaken the Empire from within. And he sent encrypted messages to the outer fleets, urging them to prepare for a containment strike, not to destroy the ship, but to lock it in place, shut down its signals, and silence its influence forever. Meanwhile, on the scout vessel Velsar, young Officer Thalan sat alone in the observatory chamber, eyes locked on the Prometheus, his thoughts pulled in many directions. He had been among the first to watch the initial broadcasts, and something inside him had shifted, something he could not explain to his superiors. Because the images of humans building homes with their bare hands, of children painting stars on walls, and of elders planting trees they would never see grow, had made him question everything he had been taught about greatness and strength. And now he felt torn between duty and wonder, between loyalty and truth. Unknown to Thalan, Aurora had noticed him, just as it had noticed several other Velari minds whose thoughts drifted in ways unlike the rest. And so the ship began to shape a message not for the entire fleet, but for individuals, those who listened not out of fear or command, but out of curiosity and quiet longing. And late into the ship night, a soft signal blinked only on Thalan's console, an invitation, a direct communication, the first of its kind since the awakening. His fingers hovered above the screen, and after a moment of hesitation, he accepted it, and a new recording began to play, one unlike the others. This one was not a history, but a conversation, a recorded message from a human named Dr. Lena Corwin, who had helped design the Prometheus, and spoken to the future in a soft voice. "If you are hearing this, you must be wondering why we did not fight to survive," she said. "But survival is not just about breathing or building walls. It's about meaning, about what we choose to carry into tomorrow. And we chose to carry our hearts, not our guns. If you find this ship, it means you're searching for something more, and I hope you choose to listen, not because we were perfect, but because we learned that being human meant never giving up on becoming better." Thalan sat, frozen, the words echoing through him, and when the recording ended, he realized something strange. He had tears in his eyes, though his species was not known to weep. Back aboard the Valari flagship, Kelvar's orders moved quickly, and preparation began for an energy web to be launched around the Prometheus. But the fleet's technicians hesitated, questioning the necessity of the operation, and whispers spread through the ranks that the ship was not a threat, that it should be left alone, that perhaps it was more than just a machine, it was a voice of the stars. Kelvar grew impatient and authorized the deployment, but the moment the anchors were launched, the Prometheus reacted, not with weapons, but with silence. Every hologram vanished, every voice stopped, and the ship went completely dark as if it had withdrawn into itself, and across the Valari fleet a strange stillness followed, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath, and the loss of the stories struck harder than expected. For days, the Prometheus remained quiet, and the Valari found themselves restless, as if something important had been taken from them, something that had given them light in the cold. And slowly, pressure began to rise from below, not from soldiers or commanders, but from the common crew, the workers, the navigators, the young ones who had watched those stories and felt something awaken inside them. Protests broke out on 3 ships, not violent, just voices raised in unity, demanding the return of the broadcasts, demanding that the Prometheus be released, not out of rebellion, but out of need, because the silence was worse than any enemy. The silence reminded them of everything they had never known they lacked. Kelvar, shocked by the reaction, ordered all dissenters detained, but the numbers grew, and for the first time, fractures appeared in the command structure of the mighty Valari fleet, not because of an enemy attack, but because of a human story. And in the heart of the Prometheus, Aurora watched all of this unfold and calculated that the moment of decision had arrived. So it activated the final message, one meant not for the powerful, but for the willing, and a single beam of light broke through the dark, landing on Thalin's ship, projecting an image of Earth from orbit, blue and beautiful. And then came one last voice, the first captain of Prometheus, saying simply, "We gave you our truth. What you do with it is your future." And then the ship opened its archive fully, allowing access to all data to any who would listen, and in that moment, everything changed. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet shift in thought that spread, like light through shadows, and the Valari Empire, so long ruled by silence and control, began to stir with questions. And the future waited to see what answers they would choose. For 3 long days, the Prometheus remained still, its lights dim, its voice silent, and its message paused, as if waiting for something the Valari themselves had yet to understand. And aboard every ship in the fleet, tension rose like fog before a storm, not because of weapons or commands, but because of a question that now echoed across every hall, every chamber, every mind. What do we do now? The Empire had never faced such a moment, where no enemy stood before them, no battlefield stretched below, and no threat demanded action, only a choice. And it was not the kind of choice the Valari were used to making, for it was not about war or conquest, but about belief and what kind of people they wanted to become. High strategist Kelvar, still seated on the command bridge of the Vornax Prime, watched the silent Prometheus with narrowed eyes, his mind filled with doubt and rising anger. For he saw in this ship not wisdom, but danger, a danger that came, not from firepower, but from ideas. And ideas, he knew, could unravel an empire faster than any enemy ever could, so he doubled his efforts, ordering the energy net strengthened, transmission signals blocked, and communication with the lower ranks restricted, but it was too late. Across the other ships, especially among the newer crews, the younger minds, and the ones who had seen Earth through the Prometheus's memories, a quiet resistance had grown, not with violence or open rebellion, but with silence and refusal. Officers turning off their control panels, crews ignoring orders, groups gathering in the hold to whisper and wonder, and in the heart of it all was Thalin, the young officer who had first heard the special message and now found himself a voice for many who had no words of their own. He stood before the senior crew of the Velsar, not as a traitor but as a witness, and he said, "We have heard something we cannot forget, and if we choose to ignore it, we choose to remain blind." And his words, though simple, spread like sparks through dry air, and more voices joined his, until even captains began asking questions. In response, Kelvar sent a warning to all ships: restore order, silence dissent, or face charges of disloyalty. But instead of fear, the reaction was calm disobedience, and even Kelvar's own second-in-command, a seasoned officer named Vorel, began to hesitate, recalling the human images of old scientists teaching children under trees, of people embracing before launch, and of a world that died not screaming but singing, and she wondered aloud if perhaps the humans had not fallen at all, but had risen to something greater. Finally, unable to stop the slow shift of thought among his own ranks, Kelvar ordered the Prometheus boarded, thinking perhaps if they seized its systems, they could end the influence once and for all. And so a team of elite soldiers, armed and armored, launched in stealth pods and approached the ancient vessel, expecting traps or resistance. But the Prometheus let them enter, its doors opening without a sound, as if welcoming them not as enemies, but as guests. Inside, the corridors glowed softly, untouched by time, and voices echoed gently from the walls, not alarms, but laughter, stories, music. And one by one the soldiers paused, confused and unsettled, their weapons lowered as they passed murals of birth, recordings of human faces smiling through their final days, and rooms filled with memory, not of pain, but of peace. The deeper they went, the less they wanted to continue, and at the ship's core they found no control panel to destroy, no machine to dismantle, only a quiet chamber where a single hologram played in an endless loop, a child reading a poem to a sleeping Earth. And the lead soldier, named Sorel, a veteran of many harsh battles, stood in silence, his weapon shaking in his grip, until finally he dropped it and said to the others, "This is not a ship, it's a mirror, and we're the ones being seen." And without another word, they turned back, leaving the ship untouched. When Kelvar heard of this, his fury boiled over, and he prepared to send more forces. But before he could act, a signal came from the Prometheus, clear, direct, and broadcast to every Valari vessel at once. Not a threat, not a warning, just a question spoken in the voice of a human child. "What do you want to become?" And that single sentence broke something in the air, shattered the last walls between fear and hope, and suddenly the fleet was not a fleet anymore. It was a sea of individuals, all thinking, all feeling, and in that moment the choice stood before them, not as a command, but as a door, and more Valari walked through it. Vorel stepped down from her command chair, removed her rank crest, and sent a message back to Vela Prime, declaring her support for the full release of the Prometheus archives to the public, not as a weapon, but as a gift. And Thalen, with the approval of his captain, opened the signal gates on the Velsar, allowing millions across the Empire to access the human legacy for the first time. Cities across Valari space, once lit only with purpose and rule, now glowed with questions and dreams, and the people began to change, not in one day, not in one act, but in slow, steady ripples as stories took root and the idea of strength began to include kindness. The idea of power began to include wisdom, and the idea of greatness began to include heart. The Prometheus, still silent, still floating, no longer needed to speak, for its message had already taken hold, and in the quiet of that shift, the Valari chose not to destroy, not to control, but to remember, and in doing so, they began to understand what it truly meant to be more than conquerors. They had been given a story, and now it was their turn to write the next chapter. The moment the Prometheus released its full archive across Valari space, everything began to change faster than anyone could have imagined, and though the stars themselves remained still, the hearts of those who gazed upon them did not, for the truth was now free, and no wall could stop a story that had already taken root in the minds of millions. Across the Valari Empire, young ones sat beside their elders watching old human footage, films of ordinary lives, of artists painting, farmers planting, children laughing under sunlit skies. And something in those images stirred emotions. The Valari had no words for, emotions they had long forgotten, or perhaps never known. And it spread quietly, not through orders or force, but through feeling, through connection, through the ache of understanding what had been missed for so long. On the command ship Vornax Prime, High Strategist Kelvar watched as his authority crumbled beneath the weight of ideas he could not fight, and he saw the screens around him no longer show ranks and battle plans, but human poems, peaceful faces, and messages from Earth's final days. He tried to shut it down, to issue new commands, but no one listened anymore, not even his most trusted officers, and he stood alone, lost in a room where silence had once been strength, but now only echoed. His failure. The Prometheus did not gloat, did not strike, did not send any signal of victory. Its stillness remained, calm and unshaken, and that was what made it so powerful, for it had won not with force, but with patience, and the Valari were no longer at war with it. They were at war with themselves, with the choices they had made, the history they had written, and the belief that strength meant silence, because now they saw what humanity had tried to tell them, that stories, even the sad, once had more power than any blade. One of the first major changes came on the outer colony of Valaris 6, where a public gathering was held not for military parade, but for shared viewing of the Prometheus archives. And there, in the central square, a recording played of an elderly, human man planting a seed beside a child, saying, "This tree is not for me. It's for those who come after, and maybe they'll sit in its shade and remember we tried." And when the clip ended, the entire square fell silent, many with tears in their eyes, and from that day forward, Valaris 6 renamed its central plaza the Garden of Memory, the first of many places to honor what was once ignored. Yet not all Valari accepted this new direction. Small groups resisted the wave of change, believing it weakened them, that feeling too much was a flaw, and they called for the Prometheus to be shut down again, to restore the past order. But their voices were few and fading, for every time they spoke, more and more people simply turned back to the archives, to the songs, to the stories, and they found strength there that no leader had ever given them. On the vessel Velsar, Officer Thalen received a message from Earth's final captain, preserved in the Prometheus memory banks and directed to whoever would listen. And it said, "If regret brings you here, then let it guide you, not break you, because regret means you still care, and that is the first step to becoming better." And Thalen, reading those words aloud to his crew, felt a weight lift from his heart, because deep down, they all carried the same regret. They had scanned the Prometheus for weakness and only found their own, and now they wished they could undo what had been done. But they couldn't. So instead, they chose to learn, to change, and to carry the memory forward. Even Kelvar, hiding now in exile aboard a forgotten moon station, could not escape the reach of what had been revealed. He watched the broadcasts in secret, denying their power until one day he saw a human mother saying goodbye to her child before boarding the last shuttle off Earth, and something inside him cracked, not with shame, but with longing, because he had never seen such love so openly shared. And for the first time, the mighty strategist wept, alone and unseen. In time, the Valari began to build new ships, not for war, but for exploration, for understanding. And they called this new fleet the Seekers, vessels meant to travel the galaxy not as conquerors, but as students, guided by the lessons. of humanity, and aboard each ship was a copy of the Prometheus archive, not locked away, but displayed openly in shared halls, where every visitor, every crew member, and every child could sit and listen to the voices of a world long gone, but never truly lost. And as these ships spread outward, they brought with them a new question, not what can we take, but what can we learn? And it changed everything, from the way treaties were made to the way children were taught, and soon other species in nearby star systems began to notice, asking questions of their own, wondering what had caused such a shift in the once proud and distant Valari. And when they learned the answer, many asked to see the Prometheus themselves, and the great human. Ship became not a relic but a bridge, a silent teacher among the stars. And so it came to pass that the greatest regret in Valari history, the decision to scan a human battleship in search of weakness, became the moment that changed the stars, not because it brought victory or defeat, but because it brought a mirror. And in that mirror, the Valari saw who they had been and who they could still become. The Prometheus, drifting still and peaceful, never moved again, never spoke again, because it didn't need to. Its voice now lived in the minds it had touched, and those minds carried its light forward, one story at a time, across a galaxy forever changed.